Welcome back to my channel, Therapy with Tasha. If you're unaware, I am a licensed clinical social worker. And I want to remind you what happens here on my channel is I am looking at and sharing useful, insightful, and informative information as it pertains to our mental and emotional health. And then I'm examining all the ways that it impacts our relationships with others. So go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already, and put on your notification bell so you can stay in the loop of when new videos are released, which is here every Wednesday. So let's dive in. Trauma bonding. Does it sound familiar? Unfamiliar? Have you heard this before? If not, what comes to mind? So I want to start by leading off with saying what trauma bonding is not, right? And trauma bonding is not two people who have trauma and then bond together. This is actually a misconception as it relates to trauma bonding in relationships, right? Trauma bonding is actually an unhealthy attachment, and it can sometimes involve where someone is idealizing someone who causes them physical, emotional, or sexual harm. And the trauma bond is something that forms slowly, which most abusive patterns do. And the person who we're going to reference, who I'll be referencing throughout this video as the abuser, they often go on to dominate the relationship. And this abuser, they're fluctuating between extreme affection and extreme abusive behaviors, right? And the abused person, who is a person who is subject to this unhealthy abusive behavior and patterns, they begin to struggle or lose recognition of these healthy patterns that are actually existing in the relationship. Again, they're losing sight of what's happening in the relationship that is unhealthy. And this is why. So imagine a relationship where your partner is offering loving behaviors. Now, this of course naturally, initially feels good for some, for many. But then there's also behaviors from that same person, right? And it's characterized by unpredictability, shifting between excessive displays of affection and extreme emotional, psychological, physical, or even sexual abuse. Now, some people hear this and they're thinking automatically it's clear, it's an unhealthy relationship. Get out. But what's important to recognize in trauma bonded relationships is the abused person, right? The one who's subject to this hot and cold behavior, 9 times out of 10, they have had early traumatic experiences, right? And these early traumatic experiences, they have distorted how they internalize and experience negative or unhealthy behaviors from the people they love. So remember, trauma can subconsciously steer us in directions that we logically know aren't healthy. The thing though that happens in trauma bonding is it's rooted in a desperate need for the relationship to continue. Subsequently, there has been 7 stages that have been identified that happen within a trauma bonded relationship that is part of its development. And I want to go ahead and look at those 7 stages. So stage 1, this is known as love bombing, right? And love bombing, it speaks to when someone is trying to influence a person through attention and affection, right? And love bombing includes excessive flattery, a lot of I loves yous, showering with unneeded and unwanted gifts. And possibly sometimes there's these early intense conversations about two people's future together. Now, the thing about love bombing is it typically brings your guard down. If someone is experiencing love bombing, right? And is bringing your guard down because you may be hearing I love yous, receiving gifts and flattery more than you ever have, right? And so it starts to feel good, and this will actually organically and naturally for most human beings, it starts to bring your guard down. And as your guard goes down, it allows for trust, positive feelings, and it ends up making you feel secure. So this goes into stage 2, and this is where the abuser is looking for trust and dependency. So now notice in stage 1, they've already begun to set the stage, right, for this unhealthy connection that is going to develop. So here in stage 2, the abused person, they actually begin to feel like the abuser is fulfilling emotional needs, right? So they may begin to isolate themselves in the relationship and with the abuser. And all the while, the abuser is encouraging this isolation to avoid the opportunity for the abused person to connect with anything or anyone that gives a sense of reassurance, normalcy, or independence. Right, and the abused person, they also start to feel like no one else will understand what they're going through. And they may become afraid to challenge the abuser. So now as stage 3 sets in, stage 3 is known as criticism and evaluation. And this is where the abuser begins to nitpick at everything the abused person does. And this makes them feel, this is the abused person, it makes them feel like nothing they do is ever good enough. And the thing about stage 3, it involves criticism and it's followed by remorse. And this can make the abused person ultimately feel grateful that the abuser starts to admit fault. However, this back and forth dance of harsh criticism followed by remorse, it then becomes the glue that is forming in this trauma-bonded relationship. Now this leads into stage 4, which is known as manipulation and gaslighting. Now I spoke about gaslighting in previous episodes of Therapy with Tasha. So if you haven't seen that video yet, you could go ahead and watch it. And again, just to highlight, gaslighting and manipulation, they are 2 forms of psychological abuse. And they are often seen in trauma bonds. Both ultimately make the abused person question the reality and perception, right? So the abused person, they're going to feel like challenging the abuser is never going to result in anything good. In stage 5 of the trauma-bonded relationship, there's resignation and the abuser starts to submit. The abused person starts to submit to the abuse, right? They no longer know what to believe. And they start to submit to this unhealthy dance in order to avoid more conflict. And this avoidance of conflict and just submitting to the abuse, this actually can be the genesis of how someone's later people-pleasing behavior goes on to be a part of how they interact in relationships with others, right? And they're doing this to ensure that the relationship stays stable. Interestingly enough here, though, there's some awareness at this point on the abused person's behalf. But it's not enough for them, awareness for them to exit the relationship. Why? Because they're still questioning whether they're to blame for the abuser's behavior. So by stage 6, which is called there's a loss of self, right? And the abused person is now settling for anything that brings peace. And this loss of sense is actually progressive, right? It doesn't happen quickly. But over time, there becomes this loss of self. And the person no longer feels like themselves, right? They've lost their own identity. And there's been such a marked way in which personal boundaries are not respected that you just begin to lose your sense of self. Now the last stage, stage 7, in the trauma-bonded relationship is when the abused person, they have what's known as an emotional addiction to the cycle, right? And Again, this means the abused person, they're struggling or they can't leave the relationship because there's actually this unhealthy emotional attachment to the relationship and the cycle of abuse. So this cycle of abuse is where the abuser, they're continuing to be hot and cold, right? And all the while the abused person is struggling to determine whether it's a relationship they need to be in, right? Due to all of the hot and cold behaviors. So now the effects of a trauma bonded relationship are actually devastating, right? There can be a loss of self-esteem and anxiety and depression, and also other mental health conditions can set in. So I want you to keep this in mind. If you find yourself in a relationship where you're keeping abusive behaviors a secret, you're lying to loved ones about aspects of your relationship, you're making excuses and defending concerning behaviors, then it's time to seek help, reevaluate your relationship, and possibly go on to leave that relationship. Because remember, a healthy relationship, it has mutual respect, trust, there's accountability for actions, and there's healthy boundaries. So thank you for watching the video. I want you to go ahead and share this video. Before you leave, drop a comment below about the video, leave a question, or simply express your curiosity about today's topic. And then I'll go ahead and I will see you next week for another episode of Therapy with Tasha.